Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's episode, we're going to start working towards a projectile ability. My next goal is to be able to damage the enemy now that I have them, but it's going to take several things to get there to be able to damage them. So the first step that we need to take is the ability that in this project, I'm going to click the left mouse button, and when I click the left mouse button, I am going to spawn a projectile, but I would like to have even the clients be able to spawn projectiles, which will really be happening on the server. And I would like the server to maintain a wide variety of different parameters and behaviors for each projectile that I spawn. And I would like to maintain the server being able to do that, but also try to do this the most efficiently that I can. So the first thing that we need to do is we're going to come into the project and we're going to go into C++ classes and going to come into the public. We're going to need a few classes. The first one I'm going to make is an actor, and this one is going to be called projectile base, and we're going to put it in projectiles. Second class that we're going to need after we have the projectile base, I'm going to come into the ability system. Under abilities, I'm going to click the RPG ability. We're going to make a C++ class of this, and this is going to be called projectile ability. The third class we're going to need is we're going to want somewhere nice to put all of this projectile data. So we're going to come into data. We're going to make a data asset, and this will be called projectile info. And the last class I'm going to make is back in here in the ability system folder. I'm going to make a blank class, and this will just be called RPG ability types. Now that I have these classes, let's start to build it. So in the ability types, we're going to define, I'm only doing this class so that I can declare the struct type for our ability system types that we need to include on other actors, so we don't get crazy with the data that we copy in headers. So now that I have this, I need to include the RPG ability types.generated.h, and then we're going to declare a ustruct, and this is going to be f projectile params. The first thing we're going to need is a T subclass of a projectile base for the forward declaration, and this is the projectile class. Make this a U property, edit defaults only. The next thing is going to be a T object pointer of a U static mesh. I'm going to display my projectiles through static meshes. It's up to you if you want to put a Niagara system here to represent it through Niagara system. If you want to do both so you can have the mesh and that's up to you. But for here, I'm just going to put the static mesh in to display this. So this is the projectile mesh, and you do U property, edit defaults only, and then what other parts of the projectile are we going to want to set? Well, we know in the projectile movement component that Unreal has, I can make a float and call this initial speed, and we can set this to like 1,000, for example. And we'll make this a U property, edit defaults only. And then I'll make a float of the gravity scale, and I'll set that equal just to 1, so everything's kind of just at 1. and then edit defaults only. And then why not we do a Boolean call B should bounce and set that to false and give it a U property of edit defaults only. And I spelled that wrong. B should bounce. And then we're going to make a float and we're going to call this bounciness. And we're going to set that equal to 0.6 F. Just to give that a U property, edit defaults only by default. That'll give us a little bit of variety at least, right? We can change the speed, the gravity, and make it bouncy, more or less bouncy. Make it look different and just be an entirely different class of projectile if we need it to be. So now that I have this ability type, I can close this for now. And in the projectile info, this is the data asset. Well, I just need a public section, and I'm going to make a tmap of f gameplay tag, which we need to include, and then I need to also make that of an f projectile params, which we need to include, which is why I did it in the struct or in the item types header. And we can call this projectile info map. And we give a U property, edit defaults only. I have this, and I'm going to have this projectile map. So now we're going to come back to our projectile ability and our projectile base here. Let's set up the projectile ability first a little bit. So we're going to need a public section. I want a constructor, a U projectile ability constructor. I need that. And then in my private section, I'm going to want a copy of an f projectile params. And because I need to use it as a variable here, I need to include the header, which is why why we did it on the item types, or excuse me, another reason why we did it on the ability types header. And this is going to be current projectile params. And we're only going to need really access to two functions for right now. The first one is going to be a virtual override, which is so virtual void on give ability. And then in the private section, I can just make a function called void spawn projectile. Now in super on give ability, what I want to do is I want to be able to get all of this. I want to be able to get this current projectile params on the server when I give them the ability. So we'll come back here, and the best place to put things if you want it to be on the server is on the game mode, right? So we're going to come to the game mode, and I'm going to give a T object pointer of a U projectile info with a forward declaration and call this projectile info. Make this a U property, edit defaults only with the category of custom values, projectiles. And then I make a getter function, U projectile info pointer returner get projectile info. Make that const. Generate a definition, return projectile info. And then if you can understand what we're going to do next, because I have that more abstract getter of this in the ability system library, we're going to go repeat the same thing there for this. So I can come to the libraries, the ability system library, and I can say static U projectile info forward declaration pointer get projectile info, passing in a const U object pointer that is the world context object. You can mark that with a U function and call it blueprint cure. Don't want to use it unless you're on the server, but it's up to you. I can essentially just copy this. But the only difference is instead of getting the character class default info, I want to get the projectile info. So now that I've copied that, I can come back into the projectile ability, and we're going to give it one public variable that's an f gameplay tag, and this will be projectile to spawn tag. Give this a U property, edit defaults only, category equals, custom values, projectile. And then what I can say in onGiveAbility is we're going to start by checking if not projectile to spawn tag dot is valid. We could just do an early return. Get rid of this auto included header. We can just do an early return, because then we can say if you projectile info pointer projectile info equals urpg ability system library get projectile info, the world context object. I don't want to make the world context object the ability, so I can say get avatar actor from info, and that'll give me the person who casted the ability, which would be like the player. So that's the player would be a good world context object, so I can give it that. Then what I could do is set the current projectile params equal to a projectile info has inside the projectile info map dot find, and the projectile to spawn tag is the key, but we need to make sure that we dereference this. So I have current projectile params now being pulled from the server every time the ability is given, and it is going to set this variable current projectile params. Well, if we make our constructor and back in our constructor, there's a variable on here called instancing policy, and the instancing policy can have a few options, but it's an eGameplay ability instancing policy namespace, and we have non-instance, instance per actor, and instance per execution. Well, normally default is instance per execution, because a gameplay ability starts with a U for a reason. It's a U object, right? So it creates, every time you give the ability, it creates the object of the ability to give it to the ability system component. But the code and everything else in there is not really existing yet. So what it does is it creates an instance of the ability in the world, runs all the logic that is in your ability itself, and then when you end ability, it destroys that instance. You could do that if it's instance per execution. Now, the thing is this is a projectile, and I want the ability to spawn a bunch of projectiles really quick, and I want to do a bunch of different kinds. If I want to swap between all of these every time I shoot a projectile and swap to a different one, I want to do that. I want to be able to spawn 1,000 projectiles if I only wanted one kind of projectile, without having to look up these projectile parameters every single time that I need to spawn a bullet, right? I need to look up the I want it to stay persistent. That current projectile params, when the instance is over, is not going to maintain that value, and I don't want to look it up every single time. So if I change it to instance per actor, then this will stay alive in the world and will be able to hold on to the value of what's ever set in current projectile params. So what I could do, now that we're trying to think about persistence here a little bit, what I could also do is in the private section, I can make a t-object pointer to an actor called avatar actor from info, and make a U property, and we're not going to fill that in, because what I could say is in here on a giveability, I could say avatar actor from info equals get avatar actor from info, and I'll double check if the projectile the spawn tag is not valid, or if not is valid avatar actor from info return. Just to see, now that we have all this saved, just to see that I can get all this data and have it all work from the client, I would like to just print a string for now. We can say G Oh, excuse me. The first thing we could check is if not is valid, current projectile params dot projectile class we can return. And this is not recognized, which means I need to include, I have it in projectiles, projectile base. And then I can just say gengine add on-screen debug message, -1 is the key. We put 5 seconds. The F color can just be cyan. And the message we're going to put is F string printf. Text in the text, it will say spawning projectile S on server. And we're going to take this and we're going to do the C style cast to the current projectile params dot projectile class. We can call get name, and that will print us what projectile we're spawning. So if I could do this for first, we're going to recompile and I'll see you in the editor. Okay, so now that we're back in the editor, let's take a couple of steps and see how we can at least just get to this print string of spawn on the server. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is come into our content, into our third person. I'm in the blueprints. We're going to come to the ability system, in the abilities, make a new folder, and this is a dynamic projectile ability. And I'm going to make a new blueprint class of all classes, and this is gameplay ability. Oh, excuse me, projectile ability. GA dynamic projectile ability. Inside here, because this is a regular RPG ability as well and inherits, we still get the input tag concept here. So why don't we have, now that we have our input, let's, oh, excuse me, I didn't mean to duplicate the tag. Why don't we add a tag, and this will be input.dynamic projectile ability. We can add this here as well. So we'll leave that as the input. And then in the custom values, I need a projectile to spawn tag. So we're going to come back into the tags and we'll just make an entirely new set. We'll say projectile dot type, or excuse me, projectile dot basic dot type 1. And then we'll make a sub tag of basic and call it type 2. And now that I have that, for now, we're just going to put projectile basic type 1, and we're going to see that this can spawn. And then you can see the instancing policy is set to instance per actor now. Well, on the end or activate ability, I just want to get to the spawn projectile, but we're going to say has authority, because we're only going to want the projectile to spawn on the server. So we could say spawn projectile. No, we can't say spawn projectile. Did I make this blueprint? I did not make this blueprint callable. View function blueprint callable. We did not make this. So I'm going to have to come back, save, recompile, and open up everything. Give me 1 second, please. Okay, now we're back in the editor. I can open this up. Now I can say if has authority, spawn projectile. And then no matter what though, we're just going to do a wait delay for now. And we're going to wait delay for 0.25 seconds before on finish we'll call end ability. If you don't have authority, then we're just going to skip the spawn projectile entirely. Now that means I have this set up. I can come back into blueprints. I need to go into input, and I need an input action, and we have an input action dynamic projectile, and I can come into the input config and we can make the dynamic projectile input action match the input tag of dynamic projectile, and then come to IMC default, and we can have dynamic projectile be an input action. that I can put on the left mouse button by clicking here and putting on the left mouse button. Now that I have this set up in the action bindings, the last thing I should need to do is come into the ability system and into the data, into the character class info, and I can say the default attributes for this, but now I can have a starting ability of the dynamic projectile ability. Now that I have it set back up in character class info, there's one more thing we need to make, which would be the actual projectile info. We're going to do DA projectile info. Now we made two types. So the first gameplay tag is going to be projectile basic type 1, and we don't have any projectile classes. So back in here, we can make a new folder called projectiles, and we're going to make a blueprint class, and this is of projectile base, and this will be BP projectile type 1. Duplicate it, which will auto call it type 2, save them. And truthfully, inside this, we don't have to set anything. We just need these there to spawn. We are going to set just the class for now because we're not doing any of this other data. However, we have the check in spawn projectile that if the projectile class is invalid, it won't get to this string. So for now, we're just going to set the class so that it can see that it's getting there. So we're going to make sure, we're going to shrink down number of 2 players, play as listen server. Oh, before I do this, I always forget this. Man, this is terrible. Come into the game mode. Remember, we store this information. I did the same thing with the character class info. Come into the game mode and make sure we put the projectile info on the game mode where it needs to be so it can be read. So I should be able to come in here, and then now when I click it, I'm spawning projectile type 1 on server, and then when I come onto the client, I'm also still spawning projectile type 1 on the server. So we're at least getting to here where we can spawn a projectile using this struct. So then what is our next step? Our next step is being able to visually see it in the world. So now that we can get to spawn projectile, now we need to see it in the world. So how we can do that is come back into our projectile base. I don't need this to tick, and I don't need begin play, but I do need the constructor. Then we can come in here. I can get rid of these. And then I can set this to false because I don't need it to tick right now. If you do, then leave it true. I don't. And in here, I'm going to make a private section, and this is going to contain a TObject pointer to a uStatic mesh component that we will call projectile mesh. And this will be a U property. And we don't need it to be anything there. And then I need a TObject pointer to a U projectile movement component, which will do a forward declaration, which will be projectile movement component. Give it a U property here. And then in a public function, I'm going to make a function called void set projectile params. And this is going to take in a const f projectile param struct that I can do a forward declaration by const reference, and we'll call it params. Now that I have this, we'll start by establishing in the constructor. I'll have the projectile mesh, and I will set that equal to create default sub-object of a uStatic mesh component called projectile mesh. And then we're going to take the projectile mesh, and I'm going to say I'm going to set root component as projectile mesh. There we go. I'm going to take projectile mesh, and I'm going to set sets collision enabled to collision enabled query and physics, because then I'm going to say the projectile mesh. What I'm going to do is set collision object type to collision channel world dynamic. Projectile mesh, we're going to call set collision response to channel, and the first thing is going to be ECC pond. We're going to set to ECR overlap, and then the last thing projectile mesh, we're going to need to set collision response to channel ECC camera to ECR ignore. That way everybody's projectiles don't interrupt everybody else's cameras and cause a whole bunch of issues. But one thing I did forget to do originally, and I need to do it here too, is I need to set is replicated equal to true. And then that means I should also take the actor itself and put b replicates to true. And then now I can come in and take the projectile movement component and set that equal to create default sub-object of projectile movement component called movement component. And I'm not going to set any values other than that in here. I'm just going to leave it at that, because I can say if in the set projectile params, if is valid projectile mesh, then I could say projectile mesh, and I can call set static mesh, and we have an object pointer. It's in the params, and it is the projectile mesh. And then I say if is valid projectile movement components. We're going to set all these parameters. Projectile movement component, we have an initial speed variable that we can set to params.initial speed. We have in the projectile movement component, I have a projectile gravity scale that we can set to params.gravity scale. In the projectile movement component, I have a b should bounce boolean that I can set to the params.b should bounce. And in the projectile movements, I have a setting called bounciness, and we can set that equal to the params.bounciness. Oh, excuse me, bounciness. So now I have a public function that I can just set all these params by passing a set of these projectile params into it. Okay, so now that we're back in spawn projectile, what I could do is get rid of this, because we know we're getting here in the code. We know we're getting here in the code, and the projectile class is valid to spawn. The only thing is, when you spawn a projectile, we're going to have all these parameters of the speed and of the bounciness and everything, and it's going to want to travel, and it simulates physics. But we need to send it to a specific place. We need to give it a valid rotation and location that it's going to spawn so it can start traveling, right? So what we're going to do is come back onto the player, because you need a scene component. The raw idea behind this is that we use a scene component or a socket on a skeletal mesh component, and from there you grab that transform, because that's all you need from a scene component or a bone is the transform. So I don't have any transform I want to put on my skeleton per se on the character, but if I just come up in the character and I make a T object pointer to use scene component, it's a lightweight little component, but we can call this dynamic projectile spawn point, give us a U property, and say visible anywhere, meta equals allow private access equals true. But that means I need to come back into here, and then I can say dynamic dynamic projectile spawn point equals create default sub-object of a useScene component, calling this projectile spawn point. And then we need to take the dynamic and we need to set up attachment to the get root component so that it follows us. And now that I have that set, what we need to be able to do is from within the projectile ability, retrieve the location of this spawn point. And how do we do that is we would come back into our editor. We're going to come into the C++ classes, back into public, and in the interfaces, we're going to make us another interface. And this is going to be the RPG ability system interface. Make sure I spelled that right. Yep. And in the public section, we can make a simple useScene component pointer return get dynamic spawn point. And then this is a U function that we're going to mark with a blueprint native event, blueprint callable. Now for dynamic spawn point, I need to come back into the character. We will inherit from the interface, public I RPG ability system interface, which will include the header. And then I can say implement RPG ability system interface, which will be a virtual useScene component return get dynamic spawn point implementation, which at this point I can simply return the dynamic projectile spawn point. So now I have access from this to get that pointer to that spawn point. So now that I have a spawn point idea, I can say if useScene component pointer spawn point comp equals, now I have the IRPG ability system interface, and I can call execute get dynamic spawn point for the avatar actor from info. That'll retrieve the spawn point component, so I can make an F vector that's called spawn point itself, and we can set that equal to the spawn point comp. We can say get component location. After I get the spawn point, I need to make a vector, a vector called target location. And for now, I'm just going to put it in the center of the screen, straight ahead of the player. We're just going to launch it directly to where the center of the screen is heading. So for that, I'm going to say avatar actor from info. I can say get actor forward vector, and we can multiply that by 10,000, and that's my target location. Now I have make an F rotator called target rotation, and we're going to set that equal to the target location minus the spawn point, and we need to wrap this in parentheses. And then after we have that, then we dot rotation. So after we've got the target location and the target rotation, what I can do is make an F transform called spawn transform. And we can take the spawn transform called dot set location to the spawn point. And then we can call spawn transform set rotation, and that's going to be the target rotation. However, you need to dot quaternion that. You can't do that with just calling it and passing in an F rotator. And then we're going to say if a projectile base, which is going to be called spawn projectile, and we're going to set that equal to get world and call spawn actor deferred, and we're going to spawn in a projectile base, and the class is in the current projectile params.projectile class, and we only need the second one is the spawn transform. And if that successfully spawns, a projectile in spawned projectile, then we can take the spawned projectile, and before it finishes spawning, we can call set projectile params, passing in the current projectile params. And then now that we've set all the params, we can call spawn projectile, and we can say finish spawning, which takes the final transform, which is the spawn transform again. And it looks like all of this stuff can be const. So let's make all of this stuff const and maintain what we can. So now if this data asset is filled in and we know the projectile class is valid, it'll get this location that I'm going to put kind of just off to the shoulder of the app player, and then it'll measure 10,000 units directly in front of it, and it will fire it in the rotation of here dead to the straight center of the scene wherever the camera is pointing, essentially. And it should be able to set all of those different values and variables based off this projectile params that it pulls off the server when you grant the ability. So I should be able to recompile with this, and we'll see where we go from here with next. All right, now that we're back in here, what we can do back in the editor is I have it in the game mode. I'm already giving in the character class info. We're handling this already, and I don't need that. So what I do need to come into is in the data and the projectile info. We've got more data to fill in. So for the first projectile, what I'll do is I'll just make it a cone. We'll leave it at 1,000. Let's leave it at default values and see what it is. Just 1,000. Now we'll make it 0.5, a little loftier, and we should be able to see that spawn into it now. Right? So let's come into here, and okay, and it's on the server, but it's happening on all the clients too, and then the client can also spawn them. But keep in mind, this is spawning it only on the server, right? And then it's just being replicated back to the client.